Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, or if you're new here, hello. It's so nice that you're here and I hope you enjoy this video. This video is actually not about books, guys. It's about my favorite podcasts, specifically queer podcasts. I have a lot of hobbies, but one of them is listening to podcasts while I commute or walk around the neighborhood each evening, because I love having something in my ear holes while I'm doing something because I get bored very easily. But specifically, the queer podcasts have really been such a joy and such a gift in my life because they've really altered my brain chemistry and how I see the world as a queer, non-binary, sapphic person that I am myself. And now that I've learned so much that I didn't know, I feel like there is no going back into like that straight world. I just want to share all this joy and this language and knowledge that I've learned with you all. So without further ado, I'm just gonna explain how I found these podcasts. There's 6 that I'm gonna talk about today, but I'm hoping to discover more and why I love them so much. So to start off, I discovered the first one around September last year, but before that, the way I found it was through 2 different paths. One of them, I discovered a book club first called Saff Lit by Nina Hines, or Haynes. I'm not sure actually. I think it's Haynes. She runs this sapphic book club where they read 1 or 2 books each month, and that's how I discovered a bunch of books that I read last year that ended up being in my favorites list. And one of them was Girls Can Kiss Now by Jill Gutowitz. And in that book, as you may or may not know, Jill talks about the Gaylor community, which is a subgroup of the Swiftie community that is mostly made up of queer people that believe Taylor Swift is queer. Now, specifically in that book, she talks about Taylor Swift being bisexual. And that caught my interest immediately. But I didn't really do anything with that knowledge just yet. And the second path that I talked about is I was looking into reading more sapphic literature. That's how I discovered this book club in the first place. But I came across a Sunny Book Nook, which is a channel run by Sunny, and they had posted multiple videos on lesbian book recommendations. And they talked about their podcast randomly on one of their videos, I think, which is called The Lavender Menace, and that's the first podcast that I discovered that's queer and that I'm going to talk about today. The Lavender Menace podcast is a lesbian podcast run by Sunny and Renaissance, who are 2 non-binary femme lesbians, and they talk about mostly pop culture, but also some political stuff because they're also both communists, and they taught me so much about communism. But specifically, they focus on lesbian books, lesbian music, lesbian movies, and just everything that's lesbian related on the internet. About the movies, I'm not gonna talk about any of them here because of the writer's strike, but if you go listen to their podcast, you can learn so much about a lot of lesbian movies that I loved and discovered from their podcast. But they also talk about books like The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, Last Night at the Telegraph Club, which I had also read before and loved. But one of the things that they both share is that they're both massive gaylers. And that was also around the time that Midnights was coming out, which is very exciting. But what makes this podcast so special is that unlike Jill Gutowitz, who just touches upon Gaylerism in one of her chapters, this podcast goes in depth in multiple of their episodes on why Taylor Swift is queer and on so many signs and Easter eggs and songs and real life people that she could have had relationships with. And it's just so much fun. It taught me how to read her lyrics through a queer lens, which I hadn't done before. I had sensed that there were some queer undertones, but I hadn't really put the magnifying glass on each and every line. Sunny and Renaissance specifically believe that she's probably a lesbian and that Joe and every single one of her relationships was a beard. And I'm slowly being convinced. I feel like, I don't know, now with the Joe breakup, it seems more plausible. But anyways, it doesn't really matter as much what label she uses, as long as she continues to write delicious sapphic literature. Besides Gaylor, they also, I love their, like, I love their titles for each episode. I like how they speak about things. I feel like on the internet, a lot of people are afraid of offending people or trying to be as liberal as possible and people-pleasing as possible. But what I like about Sunny Renaissance is that they're not afraid to talk about things that are controversial and that might hurt some people's feelings. And I like the bluntness and the honesty of how they lay out all their opinions, because it really has changed the way I talk to people now. Like, no, I'm not gonna be afraid to express my opinion because I believe it's true, and here's all the facts. Now, in one of their episodes, they collab with another podcast called The Archers, and this is the Taylor Swift episode, by the way. And that's where I discovered the second podcast that I'm going to talk about. The Archers is run by Katie and Madison. Katie is a lesbian millennial person. Madison is Gen Z. Also, Sunny and Renaissance are both my age, around that. I think they're a little bit older than me, but whatever. The Archers is a podcast that only talks about Gaylor, not anything else. I think they might in the future transcend into not just talking about Gaylor, but also other celebrities that are possibly queer. But for now, they only talk about Gaylor. And The Archers is based on the song The Archer from Lover by Taylor Swift. And this podcast mostly talks about just her lyrics, just her art, without taking her real life in consideration. Even though they sometimes do talk about like Grammygate. That was so interesting. I did not know about Grammygate. Some of my favorite episodes are the 2 Evermore episodes, because Evermore is my favorite album, even before I knew about Gaylor. And now that I know about Gaylor, I'm like, oh my god, like, how did I not know sooner? I love the episode that I talk about Grammygate and the folklore love triangle, and how it doesn't really make sense for James to be a guy, and how it's so funny that Taylor Swift keeps writing from the male perspective. Lastly, they also like read other sources, like longer sources on Gaylor. Like, they are reading or have read, and they're done, the Rebecca Harkness biography, because if you've heard the song Last Great American Dynasty, it's basically based on Rebecca Harkness's real life. So they have also read Emily Dickinson poems and drawn parallels. They really go in depth, like literary analysis, scholarly level Gaylor analysis. And you know what I find so interesting? Back when I first discovered Taylor Swift, like end of Red era, beginning of 1989 era, 2014, that's when I discovered her. I heard about the Easter eggs, learned about how she put so many little details, and there's so much lore behind her, the Taylor Swift world and who it consists of. And I was like, this is such a big world and I'm never gonna learn everything about it, and I feel like an outcast, and I feel like I'm not a real Taylor Swift fan because I know nothing. I just listen to her music. And now, like, how many years later? Like almost 10 years later, 9 years later, we're in 2023, math. I have learned so much, and I feel so inside now and not outside, and I'm so happy because, like, you never know where life is gonna take you and what you're gonna learn in your future. And now I feel like I have so much knowledge about the Taylor Swift fandom and the community and her history. I'm like, okay, now I feel like I belong here. I unfortunately did not go to the Eras tour because I didn't try to get tickets because I knew they were going to be expensive. And I tried for next year for Indiana, but I was just waitlisted. So again, I didn't get tickets. And I tried for Italy because next year I'm going to go to my home country, Albania. But you know what's so funny? The day that she announced the international dates was also the day that I experienced the worst queer heartbreak I've ever experienced in my life, which just shattered me and ruined my entire week. So I did not complete the entire registration process. So I did not get tickets for Italy either. But it's fine. I can watch the videos. I can go on TikTok, whatever. So, moving on, the third podcast that I discovered was kind of related to another person I followed before. And that person is Georgia Bridgers, who is an artist / content creator. She used to make YouTube videos and she used to be bisexual, but now she came out as a lesbian. And she was invited to a podcast called Dear Bianca. And she talked about her journey from bisexuality to lesbianism, from being in a queer relationship to now being single and in LA and dating again, how that made her realize that she actually didn't want to date men anymore, and that's what made her change her label. But anyways, Dear Bianca is a podcast that is run only by one person, Bianca. And this is a bit different from the other podcasts that have more of a Gen Z feel, because Bianca is definitely a millennial and it's like the typical like millennial lesbian or malesbian, because there's just something like Jill Gutowitz and her girlfriend. It's like very like futch for futch. And it's the same thing with like Dear Bianca and the kind of people that get invited, but I think there is like a good diversity. She also invited a trans man one time, and yeah, she basically like invites other people that she consumes their content. Also, something else I should have mentioned, Sunny and Renaissance are both femme for butch, so their podcast also focuses a lot on that dynamic. This podcast, Dear Bianca, talks a lot about the experience of being a lesbian who falls for straight women, because a lot of people who get invited talk about this, but there's also a lot of people who are older that are invited to talk about breaking up from their husband and ending their marriage because they realize they're a lesbian. So it's definitely more of an older feel with the older people that get invited, and also there's that other perspective of being a futch lesbian who falls for straight women. So that's also an interesting perspective. That's not really my perspective. I don't really fall for straight women because I'm also attracted to more masculine women and butches, which are most of the time queer / lesbian. Related to Georgia Bridgers, she also currently has a podcast with two other people who are Emily Grayson and Cadence Demir, and they're a trio who made the podcast Been Gay. And this is a very new podcast. It was created this year, and they only have like 6 episodes. But it's actually really good because they're all single. So they're bringing the single queer / lesbian perspective. I think Cadence is transmasc, so they identify as queer, but both Georgia and Emily identify as lesbians, and Emily Grayson is more masc, Georgia Bridges more femme to possibly futch, we don't know. All these words, so many words to learn. If you're new here, hi. You're gonna learn so much through these podcasts. They focus a lot on being like in your mid-20s, which I'm not yet, and I won't be for a while because I'm only 21 years old. I'm not even done with university. Like, there's so much ahead of me. But it's cool to see people who are in their mid-20s, done with school, doing real life stuff, being single, being in LA, which I don't know if I am gonna move to the West Coast for med school. I don't know. There's a lot of things to juggle. Like, life is approaching. The future is approaching. Where am I gonna go to med school? I have no clue. But I am gonna apply to a bunch of places. Not in the Midwest. I wanna leave the Midwest. I wanna get out of here as soon as I can. But yeah, this podcast made me really want to leave and go to a big city, because being a queer person in the Midwest is not ideal. There's very few queer people here, and I go to school in a university that is pretty prestigious here in Cleveland, and because it's like a smaller university, it's only like 5,000 to 6,000 undergrads, there's not a lot of queer people. And because we are like the best university here, I have tried dating people from other universities. It doesn't work out. It is not the same. And that's why I want to go somewhere where people are like me, ambitious, dream big. And last but definitely not least, I really appreciate the queer friendship and the good queer community representation that they bring, because they're very, very good friends. And you can see that through the podcast. And queer friends are very important. I haven't really had queer friends, definitely not growing up, even though like I have my suspicions that certain people are queer even though they don't admit it or they don't really talk about it because they're closeted, because living in Albania makes you really, really closeted and you're brainwashed and you just shove everything down and don't think about it. But here in America, I am mostly surrounded by straight people, but there are some queer people, at least where I live right now. But as I grow older, I want to build a queer community around me. I want to make an effort to meet and become friends with more queer people because I feel that's going to be very important for my sanity. It's great that that is possible, as you can see from this podcast. And that's what I want to do as well in my future. Moving on, the fifth podcast that I'm going to talk about is not related to any of the people that have come up here. It's just something I randomly found because I followed Muna on Instagram, which is the band that every lesbian, I feel like, loves. And they have a podcast. And it's so good. It's so good. They're so good. Their personalities are so good. More people need to know. And honestly, I haven't listened to all of their music. I've only listened to a couple of their songs. I like the one that got away. That one, I relate to that a lot, especially with my little queer heartbreak, me being the one that got away. Okay. They have some like solo episodes, but they mostly invite other people, and it's like cool people because they're musicians that are already famous. And they've like invited Phoebe Bridgers and Lucy Dacus and why can't I remember anyone else? And people that I don't know, but just by listening to the podcast, I'm like, who is this person? I want to know more about them. They're so cool. They speak in a very interesting way. But you know who I want them to bring to the podcast? So most of the people who come are queer. And you know what would be so funny if Taylor Swift, who is friends with them, they toured with Taylor Swift. If Taylor Swift comes there and she comes out on the podcast, that would be so amazing. That would be spectacular. And I actually left a review on Apple Podcasts, like, please bring Taylor Swift to the podcast so we all know why. We need Taylor Swift on Gayotic. That's the name of the podcast, by the way. It's called Gayotic. It's amazing. But also, like, some of the people that have been on the show have been, like, queer from the beginning of their life. Like, from middle school, high school. And they talk about, like, their high school girlfriends that they had while in the closet. And I'm like, that was not my experience at all. And it has made me feel like, damn, I've missed out on so much. I did not have the opportunity to grow up as a queer teen because back then I was like unlabeled. I never have identified as straight in my life, but I also didn't identify as queer because I didn't have the language. Like, I literally discovered like all the labels when I was 16 from a YouTube video because the schools didn't teach us anything, and the words lesbian or gay were used as slurs rather than just words that describe queer people in a positive way. So I didn't know what lesbian meant. I didn't know what gay meant. Or like, I knew vaguely, but I didn't really know. And I hadn't seen people who were queer until I came on the internet. And even then, like, I first identified as asexual and aro-ace until I was 19 years old because I had so much internalized homophobia. And I'm still figuring out if I do like guys or not. especially romantically, because I feel like I can be attracted sexually, but romantically it's where the problem is, because I feel like there's an emotional disconnect between me and cis men. But that's something I'm also figuring out. Like, why did I identify as aroace for so long? I don't know. But yeah, it is something I'm still dealing with. But yeah, please listen to Gayotic. And lastly, this is a podcast I discovered recently. I wouldn't say I'm in love with this one yet, but it is definitely something that I'm still slowly making my way through. It is a lot of things that I have already learned, that I already know. But again, there's people of different ages in this podcast. It's run by 3 people. It's called Sapphic Survival Guide. And there's girls there who are already in queer relationships, which is amazing to see, because I don't know many people who are in lesbian relationships. So these podcasts are so important to me, because they also talk about like their relationship timeline and how they got to where they are. And like U-hauling, that episode was so interesting. Heteronormativity, labels like bisexuality and pansexuality. There's one of the hosts who identifies as pansexual, and she has a very interesting way of seeing pansexuality, which I hadn't heard before. Like, I see pansexuality as like interchangeable with bisexuality at this point. You just like anyone who you're attracted to. It doesn't matter what their gender is. But she saw it as almost gay, but there are like a couple men that she is attracted to that do not make her a lesbian, but it's their energy who she's attracted to, like not really their appearance, and that's why she chooses to identify as pansexual, even though most of her attraction is towards women. That was very interesting. So yeah, please listen to all of these podcasts if you can. They're all on Apple Podcasts and probably Spotify as well. Some of them have more episodes than others because they've been running for a long time. They're all ongoing right now, but The Archers has really been on a hiatus recently. They haven't uploaded in a really long time, and I don't know when they're gonna come back, but I hope they do, because I love The Archers so much. And there's been so much stuff going on with Taylor recently. Like, they haven't really talked about the Speak Now release, the 1989 release, that hasn't happened yet, but the announcement. You're Losing Me, I don't think they talked about that either. That's how long they've been on hiatus. So I'm currently editing the video, but yesterday I discovered something. So you know how I was suspicious about The Archers being a little bit silent and not uploading for a very long time? I went to their Twitter, and apparently they're discontinuing the podcast, which is very, very sad, I know. But there is some good news, because on their Twitter, they're releasing all their Patreon exclusive videos that we couldn't see before. So there's a bunch of content that you can watch now on YouTube that is unlisted, but they provided the links. So you can do that if you're interested for more Gaylor content. So yeah, those are all my favorite podcasts, and I love you for being here. And yeah, bye.